In June of 1878, shares of the Bodie Mining Company were trading at 50 cents. By the end of that same month, they were worth $50, a hundredfold return in a matter of weeks. Not on some speculative technology, not on railroad bonds, but on a vein of gold and silver buried inside a hill in eastern California at an elevation of 8,379 feet, in a place so remote and so cold that the man who discovered it froze to death before he could file a proper claim. That man's name was Waterman S. Bodie, though even his first name is uncertain. Some records say William, others Wakeman. And in the summer of 1859, he and three fellow prospectors wandered the sagebrush foothills north of Mono Lake and found gold sparkling in a stream bed. They staked their ground, and then, that November, Bodie set out on a supply trip to the little settlement of Monoville, 10 miles away, and walked into a blizzard that killed him. His partners found his body after the snow melted. They buried him in the hills he'd come to work, and they kept the name. There's a detail worth noting about that name. For years, nobody could agree on how to spell it. Bodie, Bodie, Bodie. The story goes that a sign painter in the nearby boomtown of Aurora lettered a sign reading Bodie Stables, and the misspelling stuck. Whether the painter was careless or whether the townspeople deliberately adopted the new spelling to ensure outsiders pronounced it correctly, Bodie, not body, is a question nobody ever settled. Either way, the town got its name from a dead man and a painted sign. It would not be the last time that accidents and miscalculations shaped the place. For 17 years after Bodie's death, almost nothing happened. The Bodie Mining District was organized in 1860. The Bunker Hill Mine opened in 1861, and a small stamp mill was built to crush the quartz and extract what gold it held. But the camp never grew beyond about 20 miners. And why would it? The place was brutally difficult to reach, sitting on a wind-swept plateau where winter temperatures dropped far below zero, where winds could hit 100 miles an hour, where the frost-free season lasted in some years barely 30 days. To the north, the massive Comstock lode at Virginia City was in full production. To the east, Aurora was booming with silver. Thousands of miners were employed in both places. Nobody was going to struggle up to that frozen plateau for the thin promise of a small gold deposit near Mono Lake. And so Bodie waited. The Bunker Hill mine changed hands several times, each new owner hoping to find the vein that would justify the investment, each eventually running short of capital. One of those owners was a San Jose actor named James Stark, who had what you might call a creative approach to the mining business. Stark owned an opera house in San Jose, and he got the idea that he could dismantle it, haul the lumber across the Sierra, and reassemble the whole structure as a quartz mill. An opera house designed for acoustics, rebuilt for ore processing. It didn't work out the way Stark imagined. He and his partner, a jeweler named John W. Tucker, poured money into the project, ran out of it, and were forced to sell what the locals had taken to calling the Opera House Mill. The geologist J.D. Whitney, the same Whitney who gave his name to the highest peak in the Sierra, had inspected the property and written a favorable report. And so new investors came in, and the cycle of hope and disappointment continued. But then came 1875, and what happened in 1875 was the kind of accident that makes you think about the difference between luck and strategy in business. A mine cave-in, the sort of disaster that would normally shut an operation down, exposed a rich body of gold ore that nobody had known was there. 2 years later, in 1877, 4 partners bought the old Bunker Hill mine, renamed it the Standard Mining Company, and within months discovered a significant vein of high-grade gold running through quartz as white as milk. The vein was enormous, up to 20 feet wide in places, and the ore was rich, yielding between $100 and $300 in gold and silver per ton. On December 4th, 1877, the Standard Company declared a dividend of $1 per share. That announcement was the starting pistol. The boom had begun. What followed was one of the most dramatic population explosions in the history of the American West. In 1876, Bodie had a few dozen residents. By the end of 1878, it had 5,000. By 1879, the population had reached somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000. The exact number is hard to pin down because people were arriving and leaving so fast that no census could keep up. Regional newspapers were predicting that Bodie would be the next Comstock lode. Miners, gamblers, merchants, prostitutes, preachers, and con artists poured into the hills. At its peak, the town's population was growing by 40 to 50 people a day. And here is where the story of Bodie becomes something other than a standard mining tale. Because what those thousands of people built in the space of 2 or 3 years on a frozen plateau at 8,000 feet was not a temporary camp. It was a city. More than 2,000 buildings went up. Wood frame structures, most of them, hauled in as lumber from Bridgeport, from Benton, from Mono Mills. Main Street stretched for more than a mile. There were 2 banks, a Wells Fargo and the Mono County Bank, incorporated in October of 1877. There were 4 volunteer fire companies, a telegraph station, a post office, 2 newspapers, the Daily Free Press and the Standard News, later joined by others, including the Bodie Evening Miner, which began printing in May of 1882. There were doctors, pharmacists, stables, general stores, mercantiles, and hotels. At one count, there were approximately 200 restaurants. And there were saloons, 65 of them, lined up along Main Street so tightly that, as one account put it, every other building was a place to buy a drink. 3 breweries worked day and night. Whiskey arrived in 100-gallon barrels. The northern end of town came alive after dark. The Red Light District and Chinatown, running at a right angle to Main Street, offered gambling halls, opium dens, dance halls, and brothels. The local newspapers developed a grim running joke. Each morning, the Bodie miner would ask, in what passed for dry humor at 8,400 feet, "Have we a man for breakfast?" Meaning, had anyone been shot dead the night before? The answer was frequently yes. The Reverend F.M. Warrington, visiting in 1881, described Bodie as a sea of sin, lashed by the tempests of lust and passion. He was not exaggerating by much. Shootings were sometimes daily occurrences. Robberies, stagecoach holdups, and barroom brawls were so common that the phrase, "a bad man from Bodie," entered the American language as shorthand for the worst kind of trouble. One story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, involves a young girl whose family was about to move to the town. She wrote in her diary, "Goodbye, God. I'm going to Bodie." But here's the thing about Bodie that gets lost in the gunfight stories. The place worked. The economics were real. Between 1877 and 1882, the mines around Bodie Bluff produced somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $38 million in gold and silver. And that's in 1880 dollars, when gold was fixed at just over $20 an ounce. Some estimates of total production over the life of the district run as high as $90 to $100 million. 30 mines were operating simultaneously at the peak. 9 quartz mills ran 159 stamps, pounding ore day and night, the sound carrying for miles across the sagebrush. The Standard Mine alone would yield nearly $15 million in gold over 25 years. And the money didn't just flow out, it circulated. Miners earned wages, modest ones by later standards, but steady, and they spent those wages in the saloons, the restaurants, the general stores, the brothels. Some 30 companies were producing $400,000 in ore per month at the height of the boom. That river of cash supported everything from a brass band to a horse racing track that a group of 5 local men built on the flat south of town along Bodie Creek. Gambling on the races became one of the town's more respectable pastimes. Consider the stagecoach traffic alone. By February of 1878, there was service 3 times a day between Bodie and Aurora, and once daily to Bridgeport. The first non-stop stagecoach trip from Carson City, Nevada to Bodie ran on December 1st, 1877. The same month, the Standard declared its first dividend. By August of 1878, Bodie had daily mail service. Every one of those coaches came loaded with passengers, freight, and expectations. And every one of them bounced over rutted mountain roads at elevations where the air was thin and the weather could turn lethal without warning. Wells Fargo maintained a bank and an express office handling the shipments of gold bullion that went out to Carson City. Some bound for the mint there, some forwarded by rail to San Francisco. The fire hydrant system was completed on January 24, 1880, which tells you how fast the town was growing and how seriously it took the threat of fire in a city built entirely of wood at a treeless elevation. 4 volunteer fire companies organized, drilled, and competed against each other with the intensity of athletic teams, because they understood that in Bodie, a fire was not a matter of if, but when. The Miners' Union Hall went up on Main Street in June of 1878, just 6 months after the union itself was organized the previous December. It was the social center of Bodie in every sense, not just a meeting hall for the labor unions, but the place where the community came together. Dances were held there, concerts, plays, school recitals. The building still stands, and if you walk inside it today, you are standing in the room where men who worked underground for wages spent their Saturday nights watching their children perform. That combination, the industrial and the domestic, the hard rock miner and the school recital, is the real texture of what Bodie was, underneath the gunfight mythology. The diversity of the population was remarkable for a place so isolated. Irish and Cornish miners worked alongside Americans from every state. Italian immigrants opened businesses. Chinese workers, arriving mainly from southern China as contract laborers beginning in 1878, settled on the outskirts in their own quarter, a Chinatown of 2- and 3-story wooden buildings that included general stores, laundries, boarding houses, a restaurant, a Taoist temple, and, inevitably, opium dens and gambling establishments. At its peak, several hundred Chinese lived in Bodie's Chinatown. Newspaper accounts describe Chinese New Year celebrations and large funerals. But the Chinese residents faced pervasive discrimination in the mines, which forced most of them into service occupations, operating laundries, peddling vegetables that were shipped in by express, supplying charcoal, and providing much of the firewood that kept the town alive through its brutal winters. And the winters were brutal beyond what most Americans today would consider habitable. Bodie routinely ranks among the coldest spots in the lower 48 states, with 308 days a year below freezing in some measurements. Snow piled 10 feet deep, sometimes 20. The wind never stopped. Yet the mines operated 6 days a week, 24 hours a day, because the economics demanded it and because the men who worked them had no other option. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was particularly savage. Hundreds of lives were lost to exposure and disease. Falling timber in the mine shafts and the explosion of a powder magazine added to the death toll. It was the cost of doing business in a place that had no business existing, except that there was gold in the hills. Even at the peak of the boom, though, seeds of trouble were already planted. The fundamental problem with Bodie, the flaw that would eventually undo everything, was the same thing that made it extraordinary. The gold was finite, and the town had no other reason to exist. There was no agriculture at 8,400 feet. There was no timber. Every board had to be hauled in. There was no natural crossroads, no river commerce, no reason for anyone to pass through except the mines. When the ore ran out, the math would change completely, and there would be nothing to fall back on. The first signs of decline appeared as early as 1880, and by the end of that year, the drift was becoming obvious. Not because the mines had failed, they hadn't, not yet, but because other booms were calling. Butte, Montana, Tombstone, Arizona, Utah. The single men, the get-rich-quick prospectors who had flooded into Bodie in 1878 and 1879, were exactly the kind of people who moved on when the next rush started. They packed up and left. And so, paradoxically, the population declined even as the mines were still producing. In 1881, Bodie's ore production actually hit a recorded high of $3.1 million. But the population was already falling. The town that remained was increasingly a family town. The people who had put down roots, built houses, enrolled their children in school. In 1881, the Bodie Railway and Lumber Company completed a narrow-gauge railroad connecting the town to Mono Mills, about 32 miles to the south on the shore of Mono Lake. The railroad hauled lumber, cordwood, and mine timbers, all the wood that Bodie consumed in vast quantities and could not produce for itself. It was a lifeline, and it was built at exactly the moment when the patient needed one. The following year, in September 1882, the first gathering took place in the newly constructed Methodist Church. A Catholic church went up around the same time. Two churches built in the same year in a town whose population was declining. That tells you something about the people who stayed. They were building for permanence in a place that the market was already abandoning. In 1882, the Bodie mine stocks crashed, and several of the smaller mining companies went bankrupt. The two largest operations, the Bodie Mine and the Standard, merged in 1887, combining their resources to survive what neither could sustain alone. It was the kind of corporate consolidation that always signals the end of an era, even when it's presented as a new beginning. By 1886, the population had fallen to approximately 1,500. Two newspapers consolidated into one, published weekly instead of daily. It was the quiet, undramatic kind of decline that doesn't make headlines. Not a catastrophe, just a steady drain. A family leaves. A saloon closes. A mine stops paying dividends. The schoolroom gets a little emptier each year. But the story of Bodie doesn't end with the 1880s, because two men, one an engineer, one a businessman, refused to let it. Thomas H. Leggett was the mine superintendent of the Standard Consolidated Mining Company, and he had an idea that everyone around him thought was insane. The Standard Mill ran on steam power, which required enormous quantities of wood that was becoming scarce and expensive as the nearby forests were exhausted and hauling distances grew longer. Leggett proposed building a hydroelectric power plant on Green Creek, 7 miles above Bridgeport, and transmitting electricity 13 miles across the hills to the mill. In 1892, this was not a routine engineering proposal. Long-distance electrical transmission was still in its infancy. The Niagara Falls project, which would carry power 26 miles to Buffalo, wasn't completed until 1896. Nobody had done what Leggett was suggesting at the distance he was suggesting, and the local newspapers and residents thought the whole scheme was ridiculous. The man who backed him was James Stewart Kane. Kane had arrived in Bodie in 1879 at the age of 25, and he is the closest thing the town has to a protagonist who spans the entire story. His first business was hauling lumber across Mono Lake on barges, supplying the very timber that fed the mine shafts, the boilers, the buildings, and the stoves of Bodie. Wood was one of the biggest businesses in a treeless town, and Kane made a small fortune at it. He then expanded into wagon freighting and leased the Bodie Railway. In 1890, he purchased the Bodie Bank from E.L. Benedict. He was, by that point, becoming the town's principal property owner, buying up claims, lots, and businesses that other people were abandoning. Kane was a stockholder in the Standard Consolidated Mining Company, and he was one of the few people who supported Leggett's power scheme. Construction on the Green Creek plant took place between August and October of 1892. Workers enlarged and cleared a ditch, built a penstock and a powerhouse using materials salvaged from a recently abandoned mill. A generator and 4 Pelton water wheels arrived from San Francisco. Meanwhile, surveyors laid out a transmission line across the Sagebrush Hills, wooden poles spaced 100 feet apart, carrying 2 copper wires. The line ran almost perfectly straight for 13 miles. There's a popular story that the engineers believed electricity couldn't turn corners and would jump off the wire at a bend. But the truth is probably simpler. A straight line was cheaper, requiring less copper, and at a time when long-distance transmission was still experimental, minimizing the distance was the obvious engineering choice. In November of 1892, a crowd gathered at the Standard Mill for what everyone understood was either a breakthrough or an embarrassment. A signal was sent by telephone to Green Creek. The switch was thrown, and nothing happened. People in the crowd began laughing. Several minutes passed, and then, slowly, the lights came on and the motors began to hum. 3,500 volts of alternating current had traveled 13 miles through 2 copper wires and arrived with enough power to run a stamp mill. It was, by some measures, the first successful long-distance transmission of electrical power to an industrial operation in the world, though the claim is complicated by competing projects in Telluride, Colorado, and elsewhere, and it was quickly overshadowed by the Niagara Falls installation 4 years later. But for a few years, the little mining town at 8,400 feet, population declining, was on the technological frontier of the modern world. Kane counted that moment as one of the biggest thrills of his life, and the economics were immediate. The cost of running the mill dropped dramatically once it no longer depended on hauling wood from ever greater distances. The cyanide process, invented in 1890, arrived in Bodie around the same time, and it promised to recover gold and silver from the discarded tailings of 20 years of mining. All that waste rock that had been crushed, processed, and dumped, still carrying traces of precious metal that earlier technology couldn't extract. Kane leased a block of Standard Company land and, using the cyanide process, pulled $90,000 in gold out of it in just 90 days. When he tried to renew the lease, the Standard said no. But Kane eventually took control of the mill through legal action and went on to become one of the richest men in a town that was getting poorer every year. But the innovations, remarkable as they were, couldn't reverse the underlying fact. The gold was running out. And in 1892, the same year the power plant came online, a kitchen fire destroyed much of Bodie's business district. Some rebuilt, many did not. The population, which had been drifting downward for a decade, dropped faster. Additional mines closed. In October of 1898, the Standard Mill burned to the ground. It was rebuilt by February of 1899, remarkably fast, but the insurance only partly covered the damage, and the fire was another blow to a town that was running out of resilience. By 1910, fewer than 700 people remained in Bodie. The last newspaper, the Bodie Miner, printed its final edition in 1912. A California tourist guidebook published in 1913 described Bodie as a mining town which is the center of a large mineral region, and noted that it still had 2 hotels and a railroad. That same year, the Standard Consolidated Mine closed. Mining profits in 1914 fell to $6,821, a figure so small it reads like a bookkeeping error compared to the millions of the boom years. Kane by then was buying everything: the town lots, the mining claims, the remaining businesses. He reopened the Standard Mill to former employees and managed to generate over $100,000 in profit in 1915, but it was not enough to reverse the decline. In 1917, the Bodie Railway was abandoned. The iron tracks were pulled up and scrapped. The lifeline that had carried lumber and supplies into town for 36 years was gone, and with it went the last easy connection to the outside world. By 1920, the U.S. Census recorded Bodie's population at 120 people. The San Francisco Chronicle ran an article that year disputing the label Ghost Town, but the label was already sticking. The Miners' Union Hall still stood on Main Street, but nobody was holding dances there anymore. The Methodist Church was still standing. It stands today. But the Catholic Church would burn around 1928. The J.S. Kane House, one of the largest homes in town, sat at the corner of Green and Park Streets, a testament to the fortune Kane had built in a place everyone else had left. And then on June 23, 1932, a 2.5-year-old boy at a birthday party received green Jell-O instead of the cake and ice cream he'd been expecting. According to the story told by park rangers, and it's one of those stories that's almost too perfect to verify, the child left the party, wandered to the Sawdust Corner Saloon, started playing with matches, and set a fire that burned down 95% of what remained of Bodie. The fire hoses were available, the water was available, but the intake screens on the reservoir had been cleaned and not replaced, and the hoses clogged with debris. The town that had survived blizzards, mine collapses, epidemics, financial crashes, and 2 decades of slow abandonment was gutted by a toddler and a clogged fire hose. What the fire left, roughly 170 buildings, maybe 200 depending on how you count, is what you can see today. Sam Leon's bar on Main Street was one of the survivors. Leon, born in China in 1879, had operated the U.S. Hotel, the town's largest lodging house, until the fire destroyed it. He opened the bar in 1937 in a building that had previously been a restaurant. Next door, Joe Honor ran the last barber shop Bodie would ever have. The final chapter was written not by fire, but by war. In 1942, the War Production Board issued Order L-208, shutting down all non-essential gold mines in the United States for the duration of World War II. The last active mine in Bodie, the Lucky Boy, closed. Mining never resumed after the war. By then, only a handful of people remained, 6, according to one account, and 5 of them died in circumstances that added one last dark footnote to the town's history. James S. Kane had died in 1938 or 1939. Sources differ slightly. But his family continued to own most of Bodie and, crucially, continued to protect it. They hired a watchman. They maintained the vacant buildings. They kept vandals and scavengers out. When the Kane family eventually transferred the property to the state of California, the town was in a condition that no other ghost town in the American West could match. Not restored, not rebuilt, but intact. The beds were still in the bedrooms. The canned goods were still on the shelves of the general stores. The pool table was still in the saloon. It was as if everyone had stepped out for lunch one afternoon and simply never come back. In 1961, Bodie received National Historic Landmark status. In 1962, it became a California State Historic Park. The governing philosophy was and remains arrested decay. The buildings are stabilized to prevent collapse, but they are not restored. Paint continues to peel. Wood continues to weather. Rust creeps across the metal surfaces of the stamp mill. A visitor today sees the town almost exactly as time left it, not as a recreation of what it once was. The Miners' Union Hall, completed on June 28, 1878, when Bodie was exploding with new arrivals and the Standard Company was declaring dividends, now serves as the Park Museum. You can walk inside and see mining artifacts, photographs from the boom years, and the letters, hundreds of them, from visitors who took something from Bodie and wrote back to return it, convinced they had been cursed. A rusty nail, a piece of glass, a pebble. The Bodie curse is a legend that a park ranger probably invented to discourage souvenir hunting. But the letters are real, and they are weirdly moving. People write to apologize to a dead town. The Standard Stamp Mill still stands on the west slope of Bodie Bluff, most of its inner machinery intact. During summer months, guided tours take visitors through the building and explain how ore was crushed, processed with mercury and cyanide, and refined into bars of gold. The brick substation that once received 3,500 volts of alternating current from Green Creek is still attached to the Wheaton and Hollis Hotel. The power line itself is long gone, but Dynamo Pond, where the hydroelectric plant stood, is still there in the hills above Bridgeport. Somebody stacked rocks and dug a ditch and ran copper wire through the sagebrush, and for a few years, a dying town was the most electrically advanced mining operation in the world. The cemetery sits on the outskirts, a wind-swept patch of ground with wooden markers, and in the Miners' Union section, stone monuments that the Bodie Foundation is now working to stabilize. There's a cenotaph honoring President James A. Garfield, erected by the citizens of Bodie after his assassination in 1881. A reminder that even in this remote, violent place, people felt connected to the Republic and its tragedies. There's a white marble angel marking the grave of a 3-year-old girl known as the Angel of Bodie, who was reportedly killed in an accident involving a miner's pick. The Boot Hill, for those who died outside the law, was located beyond the official cemetery boundary. Rosa May, a prostitute who, according to an unsubstantiated but widely told story, nursed the town's men through a serious epidemic at the height of the boom, was buried outside the fence after she died. Helped them survive, but didn't earn a place among them. Today, about 200,000 people visit Bodie each year. They drive north on Highway 395 past Mammoth Lakes, turn east on Route 270, and follow 10 miles of paved road and then 3 miles of dirt to reach the parking area. There's no food, no gasoline, no gift shop, no recreated saloon, no costumed actors. The $5 admission, if that's still the price, it's been that for a while, gets you into a 500-acre park where you can walk the streets, lean close to the windows, and look into rooms where dust has been settling for decades. The schoolhouse still has desks lined up and a chalkboard on the wall. The Boone store still has merchandise on its shelves, canned goods and bottles from the 19th century, arranged exactly as they were left. The park rangers who live on site, some of them year-round in the old houses, enduring the same winds and the same cold that drove out everyone else, describe the experience in terms that sound almost spiritual. One longtime ranger, Brad Sturdivant, has spoken about waking up in the morning and seeing what the miners saw, the sun coming up over the hills, the same light on the same sagebrush. The Bodie Foundation, a non-profit that supports the park, raises money for ongoing preservation projects, the cemetery headstones, the railroad depot, the most at-risk buildings. It's expensive work in a place that's expensive to reach, and the need never ends. What Bodie offers, and what no restoration or reconstruction could replicate, is the texture of time itself. The corrugated metal of the stamp mill rusting in the dry air. The tilted walls of the Swayze Hotel propped up with wooden supports because the miners who built it were in a hurry and didn't get the foundation right. The Methodist Church, the only surviving place of worship, its wooden walls silvered by 140 years of weather. The vault of the Bodie Bank, its ornate green iron door still standing in the ruins of the wooden building that once surrounded it. The most permanent thing in town, designed to protect wealth, outlasting the wealth, outlasting the building, outlasting the town. There are hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath Bodie, dug by men who worked by candlelight and dynamite, who descended into the earth 6 days a week and came back up to a town where the temperature was below zero and the wind was blowing and the nearest city was a day's journey away. Some of those men got rich, most of them didn't. Some of them died underground, and some of them died in bar fights, and some of them packed up and went to Tombstone or Butte to do the same thing all over again. The ones who stayed, the families, the shopkeepers, the schoolteacher Ella M. Kane, who was born in Bodie and married the son of James S. Kane and later wrote the history of the place she'd grown up in, they built something that lasted longer than the gold did, even if they couldn't have known it at the time. The Standard Mine produced $15 million in gold over 25 years, and the total output of the district may have exceeded $100 million. But the most valuable thing that came out of Bodie was not the gold. It was the fact that when everyone left, nobody tore the buildings down, nobody sold the lumber, nobody paved Main Street for a highway. The harsh climate, the extreme isolation, the sheer difficulty of getting there, the same qualities that made Bodie such a punishing place to live made it almost impossible to dismantle. And then the Kane family, who could have sold the town for salvage, chose instead to guard it. And then the state of California chose to preserve it in its decay rather than polish it into a museum. Each of those decisions was, in its way, as consequential as the discovery of the Standard vein. Bodie sits at the intersection of two American impulses that don't usually coexist. The impulse to build something grand in the most improbable place, and the impulse to leave it exactly as it falls. The town is not a monument to failure. The mines produced immense wealth. The engineering was innovative. The hydroelectric transmission alone would earn a place in the history of technology. The community, for all its violence, supported schools, churches, unions, a brass band, and a horse racing track. But it was all contingent on a single resource locked inside a hill. And when that resource was exhausted, there was nothing to replace it. That is not a failure of the people who built Bodie. It is simply the arithmetic of extraction, and it has played out the same way in 1,000 towns across the American West. The wind still blows across the plateau. It blows through the broken windows of the houses on Green Street and rattles the corrugated metal on the stamp mill and pushes tumbleweeds down the length of Main Street, which is still a mile long, which is still unpaved, which is still lined with buildings on both sides. Fewer now, weathered and leaning, but recognizably the same street where 65 saloons once operated and 3 breweries worked through the night, and a brass band played, and a man could buy a drink or lose his life, or both, in the same evening. The Miners' Union Hall stands where it has stood since June of 1878. The door is open.